Hello, my name is Voya and welcome to My Deep Guide, and today we are taking an in-depth and objective look at the Boox Go 10.3 Lumi version, the one with the front light, and the one without the front light. So I'm sandwiched between these two as a current Boox Go 10.3 Gen 1 user. Where do these land, and do they tempt me, and do they tempt you to upgrade and change? Well, they would need to do something really extraordinarily good to offset the introduction of the active pen, which I've discussed in both of these first looks. So let's see how do they stack up in general and against the predecessor. First things first, this is simply an incremental update and a refresh of an already familiar platform, Go 10.3, and I won't go into too many details on both of these devices. The specifications are exactly the same, except for the front light on the Lumi version and 15 grams more, because Lumi weighs 365 grams, the non-Lumi weighs 350 grams. Everything else is exactly the same, which means updated octa-core SoC, 4GB of RAM, 64GB of storage, non-expandable as there's no SD card slot. We have dual microphones, we have dual speakers, we have USB-C port for data and charging communication. We have the updated ink stylus plus the active thing that Boox has introduced, which works well for an active pen, but as we've seen in the in-depth or the first impressions, it's not really something that fully can offset or compare with the EMR pen that the Boox Go 10.3 Gen 1 was using. That being said, does it mean that because we no longer have a Wacom layer, that's going to have a meaningful impact on the image quality? No, simply because the Wacom layer actually lands underneath the screen. That's how that technology works. If anything, an active layer introduces another stack if it's not combined with the touch layer stack here. So depending on how it's implemented, technically speaking, it could introduce worse image quality when you have an active pen. But most of the cases, you don't have an added layer, you just have a combined touch capacitive, and the active pen layer is in one, so it shouldn't really have a negative impact on the image quality. What will have a negative impact on an image quality is the Lumi itself. And even in this angle, you can clearly see the difference of the non-front lit version. You can see that vertical shadow here, how thin it is on the non-Lumi version, and how it is on the Lumi version, how much more darkness there is. That's that added distance between the surface of the screen and the screen itself, and that not only affects the immersion, because it does, absolutely does, but it also will have a negative impact on the image quality, clarity, and the contrast itself, because of the parallax, because of the distance, and because of physics, how it works, because light has to travel and dissipate through a little bit more before it actually is able to illuminate the electrophoretic cells in the screen, and once it actually bounces back, it needs to go through all of that added distance until it actually reaches your eyes. But generally speaking, these two are pretty much exactly alike, except for the front light, right? Well, not quite. As you will see in the DAF analysis, there are differences. For example, Lumi has a little bit faster writing latency than the non-Lumi. Go figure, I have no idea. But then again, because of the front light thing that I've talked about, the non-Lumi version will have slightly better contrast, image quality, clarity, and readability than the Lumi version. So it's not exactly the question of, oh, I just need the front light or I don't need the front light. There are other aspects to take into consideration as well. Design-wise, they're exactly the same as they were with the Gen 0.1. There are two meaningful differences. The first one is we've lost the Boox logo on the side here, and the second one is that the imperfections of how this soft layer has been implemented in the back, it was never really that good on the Gen 1. On the Gen 2, both Lumi and Classic version, this has been improved and it no longer has those sharp edges and imperfections. It's actually quite comfortable to use. As far as the reader goes, both of these are quite good devices, but both of them suffer from the same type of issues, with the Lumi suffering a little bit more because of that front light affecting the image quality and contrast. What are the issues that they suffer from? Well, they suffer from primarily ghosting. So the ghosting is something that was a bad thing on the Go 10.1, and unfortunately, because the image technology has not been improved that's used in these devices since Gen 1, it's essentially the same panel, they suffer from the same type of thing. So similar type of darkness, similar type of ghosting, and refresh times are also going to be somewhat similar, and in some cases actually a little bit worse. That being said, for me, my personal impression was that the non-Lumi version of the Gen 2 offered cumulatively the nicest reading experience of these three devices. It was easily better than what I could see on the Lumi version, but it also was better than what I could see on the Gen 1 version of the Go 10.3, also non-front lit. I don't know exactly why that is, but my guess would be that maybe they have changed the surface of the screen itself, because it feels good, but it actually, writing feels a little bit better on the Gen 2, both of the versions, than on the Gen 1. So maybe the structure has been changed, maybe the material, maybe the thickness of the glass has been changed. Whatever has been done, it feels better, but it also allows for a slightly better image quality subjectively, and as we'll see in the DAF, objectively as well. These being Google Play devices, that means that in conjunction with the really powerful Neo reader that is able to do a lot of awesome things as far as PDF processing and document processing goes. That means that you can install Kindle, you can install Kobo, you can install whichever app that you want and use it on this as your combined reader solution. And because it has both of those HD and speed refresh modes, that means that you can enjoy it the way that you want, with the caveat being that if you're using the speed mode, you need to be aware of that image degradation, which is very, very real. So the speed mode will alleviate the ghosting and it will speed things up naturally, but at a fairly steep cost of the image quality. For me personally, HD mode is the one that I'm sticking to, and a swipe gesture here to clean the deghosting. That is simply a combination that works well for me, but for you, maybe the speed mode will work as well. As far as writing feel and writing capabilities go, well, writing capabilities are exactly the same across both of these devices, and including Gen 1 as well, once you update it to 4.2, because it has received OS 4.2 as well. So once you put them all on equal leg, they have the same exact type of functionalities, which means introduction of the infinity page here, or infinitely scrolling page in notebooks. You can insert images, you can insert shapes, you can fill shapes, you can add links, you can add outlines, and all sorts of things like audio recordings and tons of things. You can convert documents into notebooks as well, which then allows you to copy pages and duplicate pages to expand it without ruining hyperlinks, for example, if you're using one of these devices in conjunction with MDO or MMP. What are those? Well, those are my own organizer products that I have on mydeepguide.com/shop, and recently I've released the new MDO 2026 and 2027. Both come now in color version and monochromatic, but they've been proved to be the best versions that I've ever been able to make, and both of them work perfectly well and awesome actually on the Go 10.3. With that octa-core CPU, that means that they can actually handle very successfully a huge notebook with 1800 pages, such as an MDO is. But yeah, that's a very, very good companion for these devices, especially when you take into consideration that you can link to other document or create outlines, which is basically a table of contents inside of the already provided table of contents of the notebook, which basically makes it an ideal companion for devices like this. Writing feel is actually quite nice on both of these devices when using these pens. And for me, that has to do with two things. And the first one is I think that they've improved the surface of the glass on top of the screen on the Gen 2 version. And the second one is that these pens are using felt nibs, but they're a little bit different than the ones before. And there's another aspect that I'm not entirely sure on, something that I'm gonna have to test a little bit to kind of see if that's what I'm reacting to positively or not. So I'm not going to disclose or guess on that yet, but these two for sure give a nice feel. That being said, there are quality differences between these two pens, for example. So this one is from Lumi, this one is from non-Lumi version. And on the face of it, they're supposed to be identical, right? Just the only difference is the difference in the color of the button and the color of the top here, just to differentiate which one is which. But the one with the Lumi version, at least in my case, the one I got, it has this kind of clacky thing, almost as if when you start adding pressure, that the quality is really not that good, and then you get some creaking and some cracking from time to time, which is rather unpleasant, and it really gives off a super cheap type of feel, which was not the case with the pen on the Lumi. Now, is this a, individual case-by-case basis? I pretty much am sure that it is. I wouldn't be so sure that it means that the Lumi pens are better quality than these ones, because on the surface of it, they're basically identical. But you never know. Maybe the production of the darker plastic that goes into this one is more of a different quality, and maybe that clicks and cracks or something. I honestly don't know, but that's actually what I noticed. So the writing feel absolutely is usable on both of them, and it's the best writing performance and feel of an active pen that Boox has managed to do thus far. So you don't have to worry about the whole thing, oh, is it usable or not? However, if you're comparing with an EMR or Boox Go 10.3 Gen 1, in my opinion, there is no comparison based on pressure sensitivity, reliability, consistency, and the precision itself. Latency, yes, it's better on both of these than it is on the Go 10.3 Gen 1, but that's not really a big claim, because Go 10.3 Gen 1 had a really slow latency to begin with. So neither of these devices are blisteringly fast. On the contrary, they're on a mid to slowish kind of side of things, but usable. Aside from that, everything else is exactly the same on both of these devices. Android 15, Google Play, capabilities, shortcomings, benefits, all of the other stuff, it's exactly the same on these two. With that covered, we now go on to the DAF, or the display analysis portion of the review, where we're going to compare the Boox Go 10.3 Gen 2 Lumi with the non-Lumi version and with the Gen 1, and see how they actually compare objectively. I'm going to be comparing both of the Lumi and non-Lumi at the same time, and on the left hand side you will see the examples and the results of the DAF testing of the Lumi, and on the right hand side it's going to be the non-Lumi version. As usual, let's start with the readability. We can see that they are both performing quite similarly, but there is a slight advantage in larger fonts on the non-frontlit version when compared to the Lumi version, with a tiny bit of advantage in the tiny fonts on the non-frontlit version. When we step down to 70% readability, yeah, that advantage kind of stays present and actually amplifies a little bit. And then when we go down to 50%, it stays even more present, which basically just simply confirms the physical fact that when you add more distance between the surface of the screen and the screen itself, it is going to have a negative effect on the image quality, in this case readability, which is what we're testing. When we switch over to thin fonts, the same story continues. They're very, very similar, but for the most part the readability is not only measurable, but actually you can see the difference between, for example, if you look at the largest fonts, because it's going to be easiest to see on your screens, you can see that they're crisper, they're sharper, that the contrast is simply punchier, and that affects the readability as well. Especially when we go down to the 6 point here, you can see how much more paler the image or the characters are on the Lumi version. And that should translate, and it absolutely does, in a very meaningful way, especially on the smallest fonts, between the front-lit version on the left-hand side, where it's barely legible, and on the non-front-lit version, you can actually physically see the difference in clarity and readability between these two devices. Moving on to the thick fonts, and we have actually, that's where the paleness will work to the advantage of the Lumi, because the thick font is testing for the bleed, and these are the imperfections of these screen panels, and they're using the same screen panels, but if you make them a little bit less kind of punchy, then it's going to be a little bit less bleed and more readable. And that's actually what we see here in the scores. So all of these things are starting to make sense, because in the larger fonts we don't have that much bleed, so the non-front-lit version wins. In the tiny fonts where there is more bleed, well, the Lumi wins because it has less contrast. And when we lower down to here, we can see that the Lumi version has still some slight advantage in the thicker fonts, but that's the only area where it actually managed to have an advantage over the non-front-lit version. Moving on to the contrast and uniformity and portion of the test, where pure white page and pure black page are rendered in excellent, average, and poor lighting conditions. Here we have Lumi on the left-hand side, non-Lumi on the right-hand side. We can see that the Lumi is in excellent conditions, a little bit darker than the non-front-lit version. However, as soon as you go down to average and poor lighting conditions, that difference becomes basically negligible, and they are virtually identical. As far as the blackness level goes, well, we have that's where we are starting to see a more consistent difference. So let's see, blackness 88 versus 85. Yeah, so across the board, rendering of the black color on the non-front-lit version is better. So that means that the contrast is going to be across the board a little bit stronger and a little bit better on the non-front-lit version. On the Lumi, we also have the front light at 50%. We can see how it actually affects the content. And when we go to 100%, we can see that only in the poor lighting conditions, the maximum front light is obviously going to introduce washing out of the black colors, but the average and excellent lighting conditions is going to be pretty much equalized, which is a good thing to see. When we take a look at the ghosting, we can actually observe that none of them are good, but the non-front-lit version, for whatever reason, suffers from ghosting even more than the Lumi. So I don't really have an explanation for that, but it's absolutely there. And you can see clearly in the images here what the aftermath is when flipping from a page of content onto an empty page. It's just really all over the place on both devices. Reflectivity is, for all intents and purposes, nearly identical between these two devices. So we have the same type of and character of reflection diffusion of the edges there. So it's quite okay, although it does dissipate over an extended area, which means that there's going to be some glare of reflections, but that intensity is not really too high. So overall, the reflectivity performance is good on both of these devices, and both of them have a very, very similar type of reflectivity character. Surface roughness of the Lumi version is at about 0.62, which is actually quite good for this type of a device, but far more importantly, I guess this is the reason why I reacted positively that the writing feel on the Gen 2 is nicer than on the Gen 1, because we have a much healthier type of a roughness curve on this updated surface that Gen 2 is using, because we have very good peaks and valleys here and very good distance between peaks and valleys, which will allow for the tip of the pen to actually go into there and feel those peaks in reality and not just kind of glide over them and not feel them at all, as was the case with the Kindle Scribe Black and White and the Colorsoft. And on the non-Lumi version, we have 6.635, which is a smidge more and a slightly better, even more differentiated type of a writing feel, because you can see that this under the lowest one is kind of waving about in a nice fashion, and that actually gives you an even better type of feel of unevenness and less glass-like type of feel, which is exactly what I was feeling on both of these devices. So it's interesting that they're very similar, but there's a ever so slight edge to the an advantage to the non-front lit version as far as the surface roughness and the profile curve goes. And the battery life, well, interestingly, with the front light off, the non-front lit version of the Go 10.3 is a little bit more efficient than the front lit version, in the reading at least, but in the writing, it actually performed better. So I think that this varies quite a bit between what is the device doing in the background while performing all of these tests. And since both of them have the same internals and both of them are using the same battery, I think that I would attribute these differences to the background operations of the Android system, depending on when and what type of activity was being done during the tests, something that I don't really have control over, rather than the overall impression that this one is in better performance than the other one. So that's basically my interpretation of these battery results. But overall, they are okay. We'll see how they compare actually with the Go 10.3 Gen 1. But before we start the comparison of all three devices, I just want to visit the curve of the front light for the front lit Lumi version, and we have quite a bit of a range here and flexibility between in the lower range, in the mid range, and it ramps up all the way to 583 lux, which is way more than what you would ever need in any of these cases. I think anything over 350 lux is just too much, but okay, it's there, so you have that ability to kind of pump it up that far. And as far as the calibration of the warmness and the coldness of the light, we have 2914 kelvins for fully warm, 6030 for cold, and mixed at around 4099. So a little bit on the warmer side of things in a 50% mix, but overall okay. And the maintaining of the intensity across the different types of color here is actually okay. So we have 542, 583 and 604. So it's not a huge bow and loss of light intensity depending on the color mixing. And now let's compare the Boox Go 10.3 Gen 1 without the front light, of course, then Boox Go 10.3 Gen 2 without the front light, that's the second device here, and the third one, Gen 2 Lumi with the front light. And starting with the readability, let's see how they compare. We can see that in overall score, Gen 2 without the front light actually outperforms in a meaningful way both of the Gen 1 and the Gen 2 Lumi here. The only area where the Lumi version actually kind of goes a little bit better is in the thin fonts, but everything else is basically won by the non-Lumi version Gen 2. Switching over to contrast and uniformity, here we actually see an interesting thing happening, and that is that when we're checking out the contrast, this is again a confirmation that addition of a front light and a front light stack will have a negative impact on the contrast of a device, which in turn will have a negative impact on readability and clarity. And we can actually see that being measured here, where the Gen 1 and Gen 2, which are basically the same type of screen and without the front light, are measuring at the very similar level of contrast, while the Lumi version trails down ever so slightly, but definitely measurably and observable, as we've seen. Where Lumi actually outperforms the non-Lumi version and the Gen 1 is in uniformity. So that means that when we combine the scores, Lumi and the non-Lumi version are essentially kind of the same. So one is more uniform, the other one has more contrast. But the surprising thing here is that Gen 1, generally speaking, outperforms both of the Gen 2 versions in contrast and uniformity. Reflectivity, this is really interesting to see that the score is basically like neck and neck against all three of the devices. But it's also insightful to see that the intensity and sharpness, the character of the reflectivity is different between these two. Gen 2 has a better sharpness diffusion, but it's a little bit more intense, the reflections themselves, than on the Gen 1, where the intensity was lower, but the diffusion was a little bit less, so they were sharper. So different character, but overall kind of performance on par. Ghosting, well, it's interesting to see just how bad ghosting is on that Gen 1 Go 10.3, because you've seen just how bad the ghosting is on these two devices if you watched my first impressions video. If you haven't, you should. But yeah, in ghosting performance, none of these devices are good as far as ghosting performance goes. However, out of these three, Lumi Gen 2 is the best, closely followed by the Gen 2 non-Lumi, and then all the way down at 45.71 is the Gen 1 version, which is like haunted at this point. Surface roughness, interesting to see here the differences as well. So we have different characters, but overall improved surface roughness and the character on the Gen 2 version. But generally speaking, they're very, very similar to each other. Refresh time is quite interesting to see here, but then again, there is like an explanation for this, because this was measured and combined all of the different refresh modes that this device Go 10.3 Gen 1 had in OS 4.0. And with the introduction of 4.1 and 4.2, we have now eliminated some of the refresh methods, which were maybe faster, and we now only have HD and speed. So I think that that's the explanation here of these results. So we'll have to rerun the test with the 4.2 on the Go 10.3 and kind of at some point compare these again. But we can see that between Gen 1 and Gen 2, or Gen 2, Lumi and non-Lumi, there are some slight differences here, and that the Lumi, for whatever reason, either in that test run or overall, but it was a tiny little bit faster in refresh time than the Gen 2 non-frontlit version. Writing latency, well, it has been improved, and I'm surprised to see that actually again here Lumi version is a little bit faster, which just goes to say that the screen stack that uses a front light is maybe a better performing screen, because it had a little bit less ghosting, it had a little bit faster refresh time, and it has a little bit faster writing latency than the non-frontlit version. But that being said, none of these are actually fast, because we're talking about, 21 milliseconds on Remarkable Pure is not really excellent performance. We should be seeing sub 20 millisecond performance here. And when you take into consideration this is using an active pen, we should be seeing sub 10 millisecond performances here, but we're not. We're actually seeing just barely incremental improvement in speed when compared to the Gen 1, which uses EMR. And again, I don't know if this has been improved with the OS 4.2 on the Gen 1, which would be interesting to see as well. Surface distance, again, we have a downwards trend. So obviously the frontlit version is going to have that 1 millimeter distance. So that's standard, that's expected. The non-frontlit version is actually not matching the surface distance of the Gen 1. It actually has a little bit more distance than the older device. And lastly, battery life, how it compares to the Gen 1. I've already commented on the differences between the Gen 2 versions, right? Reading, Gen 1 was outperforming both of them, but in writing with the front light off, Lumi again was outperforming both of the other ones, which is rather interesting to see. So we have here 12.5 hours with the front light at 50% and 6.67 hours at front light full. All of these results are quite good as far as the battery life goes, which is not a surprise because Go 10.3 traditionally had good type of a battery life. So it's good to see that that maintains through the line of the devices. So what does that mean for the final results? Well, that means that they are really similar, but we have marginal fractional improvements here. So we have, in the last place, Go 10.3 Gen 1 at 49.95, then Gen 2 non-front lit 51.13, and then Lumi 51.64, which it got there only because of the front light doing a lot of heavy lifting as a bonus here for the final DAF score. We should be able to see some of those differences, absolutely. When we take the front light out of the equation, we can actually see that the non-front lit version is outperforming all of these Gen 2. And we'll go to notebook. Well, again, they are very similar, simply because of that contrast, uniformity, and image quality penalty that the Lumi version gets. However, when we go to the tablet, when the front light and refresh and the ghosting matter a lot, that's where Lumi actually pulls ahead. And that might be the most meaningful one here, as well as the end result here, because what does Go 10.3 actually represent? Well, it represents an Android 15 tablet that happens to be using e-ink screen. And if that's what you want to use it for, well, then as you can clearly see here, Lumi version of the Gen 2 Go 10.3 is the best fit for such type of use. However, if you just want to kind of enjoy reading, well, then the non-front lit version of the Gen 2 is the one for you. And overall, yeah, they are very similar. So it depends on what your use case and priorities are, as which is the device going to be the best fit for your needs. So that's the Boox Go 10.3 Gen 2, Lumi and non-Lumi of these two. And to me, there weren't any positive surprises, to be quite honest, other than the fact that the active pen is usable. So that's a really good thing that it crossed the threshold. Stop tickling me. And he would have absolutely the right to say stop elbowing my face. Anyway, clearing the threshold of usability, it's like, okay, cool, but shouldn't that be the minimum, the absolute basic minimum for a device that you're going to put out on a market? Maybe my standards are too high and my expectations are too high, because everywhere where I look, not just e-ink devices, I am seeing a sharp declining rate. So maybe that's simply the state and a reflection of where we are in today's world. But if I'm just comparing either of these two devices with my Go 10.3 Gen 1, especially now that it's updated to 4.2, so it's on equal footing with these guys, am I tempted to upgrade to any one of these? Absolutely not. Like there's nothing, there's literally not a single thing about these devices that would tempt me to actually upgrade, because I don't see them as upgrades. However, that's my subjective take. You, for example, may value the front light of the Lumi, which is perfectly fine, but be aware that the writing precision and the drift and everything else and the comfort will be worse on the Lumi than it is on the Gen 1. As for the question, should you upgrade from Gen 1 to Gen 2 non-front lit? I can only subjectively tell you, and in my guess, the only positive that I can think of is Android 15. Nothing else about this can possibly be worth it, because it's just too similar, and everything is exactly the same and the writing is worse. So I don't see the point. Where these devices do make sense, and where the non-front lit device is actually quite interesting, is if you pit it against the Remarkable Pure, because they're both non-front lit, and they are both at a similar-ish price range, except that you actually get quite a bit better value with the Go 10.3 Gen 2 non-front lit version. So that's something that's going to be worth checking out and see how do they actually stack against each other in DAF. I know already that Remarkable Pure with 21 milliseconds has a better writing latency than this one. So Remarkable Pure wins there, but this is a 300 ppi screen. This one's actually lighter than the Remarkable Pure. It's thinner, it's more modern, it's more functional, but then again, it's Boox. So that, I think, is going to be an interesting point of comparison sometime in the future. For now, that is the in-depth review of the Boox Go 10.3 Gen 2 line of devices, front lit and non-front lit. So tell me what you think about these devices. Is this something that you are tempted to upgrade if you're already an owner of a Go 10.3? Or is the Lumi version the one that you were actually waiting for, because it's like a rare beast? 300 ppi with the front screen monochromatic. It's actually more rare than you would think. So in that kind of aspect, this one actually carves out and makes far more sense than the non-front lit version, which doesn't really provide enough of a meaningful difference and upgrade to the Gen 1 version. What's your opinion? Thank you so much for watching. Stay safe, stay healthy, and see you in the next video. Bye!